knight f6, c4, g6, knight f3, bishop g7, g3, short castle, bishop g2, d6, short castle, knight c6, knight c3, a6. Well, one of the ways of facing this system, the setup with knight c6 and a6 for white, is to make a double fianchetto and to try to develop the bishop to b2, which always makes sense. All kind of double fianchetto systems are very solid positionally, because this bishops from g2 and b2, these fianchetto bishops, they control the good part of the board, and the most important, the center 4 squares. What to do against this? Of course, as I said, I mentioned before, one of the ideas of a6 was the preparation for launching a queenside attack. So the point is for rook b8 in order to prepare b5. Especially when the bishop will come to b2, the threat will be to take on c4 and to take on b2. Yeah. So here he's got few possibilities. One of them is to try to stop b5 with a4. In this case, it's very easy. We go e5, d5, and we have the chance to play knight d4. Knight d4, e d4, knight a2, c5. This temporary sacrifice of the pawn. But after queen b6, we will take it back and we'll have good position. So this a4 is not helping white. Another option for white could be e3 here, bringing similar situation from the a to move e3. In this case, immediate b5 should come, and again, like in that example, immediately to take on c4, because if he takes here with the pawn, then we have very strong e5 destroying the center, and if he takes with the queen on c4, similar like in the previous example, with 8 e3, we go knight b4 in order to put our knight to d5. For example, a3, bishop e6, queen e2, and knight d5. Knight d5, bishop d5 with equal chances. This was Stango-Baklan. After b5, he might also try to play knight d2, and of course for him it's much more convenient to take on c4 with the knight, especially now this bishop is working quite seriously, attacking our knight. In this case, you remember when the knight moves many times, especially lines when the pawn is already on e3, we have this intermezzo, this intermediate move, bishop g4, provoking for f3. After f3, the diagonal will be closed and the bishop on g2 will be closed. And if he goes here, not f3, if he goes something like knight e2, then already knight a5. Of course, the knight is inferiorly placed on e2. If he goes queen c2, then we have very important tempo, knight b4. So actually that's not an easy task for him to find a move after bishop g4, because after f3 we go back and we have a comfortable situation. As I said, we go back to d7 because this pawn is f3 and it's not exactly what he wanted to achieve. So remember this trick on knight d2 or knight e1, sometimes this bishop g4 move. That's why this 9 e3 is not worth playing. The serious move which worth considering is knight d5. This is much more serious. Here we have to take, and this is a little bit of forced lines we have to remember. Knight d5, c d5, knight b4. Because you see this knight is a little bit in the air. I mean, it's, for example, if we cannot take on d5, then after a3 we just lose this knight. So please pay attention to that factor. e4, classical undermine by f5, rupture of the structure, So we on a3 we will take on e4 already. So he has to play knight g5. And now another brilliant move, c5. If he will take on c6, he might even take back with the knight. So he can continue here bishop b2, but then after h6, knight e6, take. Again we have knight c6. Or if after h6 he goes, if he goes a3 himself, we can simply take on d5 and then take the knight on g5. So bishop b2 doesn't help on c5. Yes, because we have this h6 move. On a3 we just can take simply on d4 and then knight a2. So bishop e3 same, h6 and take on d4. As I said, maybe the most natural way for white is to take on c6. Here we will have a look at the game Bulski-Chaparino from 2012. Black took on c6, e5, bishop f5. I already like black's position. Bishop e3, d5, g4, bishop c8. Well, white made active moves, but we already said in this chapter that pawns that don't move back, and this is exactly the case. Now this weakness, if knight cannot go to f3 because of bishop g4, and also maybe he doesn't like to play to h3. So the game went h3, queen d6, queen d2, h6, knight f3, h5, gh5, and bishop h3. Of course, Ivan Chaparino is a very dynamic player, and he overtook initiative in this game. That's all about knight d5. So we have to remember this thing that we take the challenge and play knight b4, and on e4 we play f5. This is important to know. And from the other hand, we always keep in mind this move c5. That's we have to remember, that we have to know. On rook b8, of course, the main line is b3 here. Oh, sorry, bishop b2, on which we should play b5, cb5, ab5. Okay. Before going to the main lines, I must inform you that there is a possibility of knight e1 attacking our knight on c6. So then the easiest will be for us just to put the bishop to d7, like in many other cases we do. cb, ab, rook c1, b4, knight a4, and here knight a5 is good enough. By the way, pay attention to this knight. It's on a4, it's on the edge, and it's not very well placed. Just you have to be careful with the b4 pawn. But already now we can double his structure, for example, double his pawns after knight d3, bishop a4, ba4. And here usually we have two plans, one knight d7, c5, but this is slow here. That's why we play queen d7, targeting the a4 pawn, so the queen cannot really move. e4, that's one of his main ideas, to try to control and to take the advantage in the center. For that, usually it's very important to have the reaction on e5, to always put knight d5. This is enough to remember. This was my game with Nemeth Ivan from 1993 with Nbil. Let's get back to the move 9b5. If queen c2, then we simply take on c4 and play bishop f5. This is easy. And then on queen d2, knight e4, or knight a5 already, even I see it's a good point. And on queen d3 also we take tempos with bc4, queen c4, and knight b4. Typical ideas. So cb5 is the main line. We take ab5. Yes. And now d5, knight a5, knight d4. First we play b4. If knight cb5, then knight d5, we have a nice tactics. And if knight a4, then e5. Remember, I already mentioned this today, that when the piece is on d4, white piece on d4, always this move c5 and e5 are very tempting. Even the pawn can take en passant. Here exactly the case. e5, d6, fe6, knight c6, knight c6, bishop c6, e5. Here you see this bishop on b2, it's already limited by black pawns, very strong. And after queen c2, bishop h3, bishop g2, bishop g2, king g2, rook f7. This was the game of none against neither. Black had a slight advantage thanks to better pieces, and you see the pawns are quite strong. So this we discussed after a b5. If he goes immediately d5, then we say the knight a5, b4, bishop d7, or e5, whatever. If knight e1 now, again knight a5, this is knight a5 is the idea before. If rook c1, which is the main move, 11, then again we go b4, and here a little bit of a difference, because on different moves we put differently our knight. That we have to remember. If he goes knight b1 now, then already better square for the knight is not to a5 but to a7. So what is the point behind this move? It's we would like to play with knight d7, bishop a6, and c5. That was my game against Lutz. Yes, exactly this was knight e1, knight d7, knight d3, bishop a6, and followed by c5. If queen c2, also bishop f5, it's very strong here, and after queen c7, this we need to put on the board. It's a small line of pawn sacrifice. Queen c7, queen c7, rook c7, not enough squares. What I like in this line, it's this habit of seeing the whole board after rook a8. There is no way to defend the pawn on a2. So after knight a7, knight b1, knight a7, normally he should go knight e1, knight d7, knight d3, bishop a6, queen d2, then we take on d3 and c5. If knight d2, then we take on d3 and knight b5. So if d5 here, the only way to exchange the bishops after bishop b2, knight b2, e6, d fe. You see, again, we create this pawn majority. The bishop on e6 is very active. We have the c5 square. We have many things here. So the position is already slightly better for black. From this point of view, maybe knight a4 is a better choice for him. Knight a5. And here the plan for us will be the same as in previous examples. From one hand to play bishop d7, and if he, for example, here he puts d5, bishop d7, always against this pawn d5 we have these e moves, e6 or e5. In this case, if knight d4, e6 is good enough, take on e6, and this is similar to Nan's game. Queen c2, it's another option for him, attacking immediately. Actually, one of the main ideas of the whole setup is to attack on the c file. In this case, easy move is c6, knight e1, bishop e6, knight d3, bishop b5. So he cannot take on b4 because of bishop a4. Rook fd1, let's say, queen d7, e3, queen a7. This setup, we can see it's very solid, extremely solid for black, and I would prefer with here black in this situation. So let's make a few conclusions about the whole line with 8b3. First of all, we continue our play with rook b8 and b5. We try to attack this knight on c3 to push it either to b1 or to a4. If he goes to a4, then we catch him there after bishop d7, knight a4, and sometimes bishop a4. If he wants to counterattack in the center with e4, usually our reaction is to play c6 on e5 to have knight d5. Otherwise, if he goes knight b1, then knight a7 is good enough. In order, sometimes even we can, after queen c2, bishop f5, and take this pawn on a2 after knight b5 and rook a8. So this is quite a rich position for black. If he goes d5, in many cases we have this e6 or e5 moves. After exchanging on e6, we have majority in the center, so which helps us to control more squares.